So, I've been always talking to other people about positionality and what that means in terms of like where I come from. Always reflecting on this sort of this on-reserve lived experience and the images that I gathered from, I think I was 16 when I started photography. And so when I went to Sheridan College in 1980, 81, these first three images are images of my mother and my grandmother's friends. So I think it was 19 when I did these. So it was just a way to have a relationship with the camera on reserve and to remember people. This is Mary Major. She's related to Rick Major, who teaches at McMaster. And this is Hardy Porter and Melinda Froman. So anyways, the primary focus of my work has been on starting with condolence. And so the condolence ceremony for me became a primary way to deal with loss and trauma and things that we really didn't talk about back then in the middle of the early 90s or the 80s. And so I sought out certain knowledge keepers. Back then it was Jake Thomas. Back then it was the Woodland Cultural Center was primarily the place where one would learn culture, language, and it was the doorway into also the ceremonial world. And Jake had started to document and share audio tapes and written materials on condolence. And so these mnemonics became not only aids to memory, but they also became a part of my starting point to look at the oral, from an oral tradition to the pictorial of the mnemonics, to the visual, to the photographic, to the video. And then once I found out that the title holders were given their names by the peacemaker through a series of interviews, and their names actually reflected where they met the peacemaker, the landscape, and also their mental state as well. So those first titles that still exist today come from that interaction, that one-on-one interaction. So, these mnemonics, they have such deep meanings on many different levels. The first one with the little pillow underneath the head is the Great Law, and it's seen as a cornice mat that we lay our heads on the Great Law to absorb the message. It's really deep metaphors like that are found in the language as well. When you start to take apart even different words. So I did a portrait of Jake, 1991, and so he was primarily the first person that I had contact with that was accepting, that was, because our reserve was divided, as probably many of you know, by the federal government in 1924. So Jake really did, clear a path and started teaching quite a bit about the different wampum belts and the significance and the roles and relationships from the Great Law of Peace. So then I started to do different things with my photography. I went to James Bay and met some people and did that. That piece called Waje, which is hello. And spent some time up there, and I started taking more portraits, continued to take more portraits through the 80s and 90s, and started to work on, this was in 92, this was in 90 at Gallery 44. So the artist-run culture for me really was the entry point into the art world in Toronto and, you know, throughout Canada. So it was there that these spaces were opened up primarily, you know, by advocates and allies that worked there that allowed me to come in and really curate my own work, which I still do today by the way, and then share what I've learned. So I started to do a series of landscapes on stainless steel. This was my response to oak. It was positive, distinct, forward movement. It's a series of lithographs, 30 by 40. It's in the collection at Art Gallery Hamilton. And so I really did start to use I started to develop my own language around my work and started to develop my own aesthetics, like positive, distinct, forward movement, and started to use that as a template to judge my own work, especially when I worked in series. So I started working in series quite early, and this is called the requickening address, and it's actually the visualization of the 15 sets of strings of wampum that are passed back and forth between the clear-minded ones and those who are mourning a death in the requickening ceremony. So there's all sorts of, like we heard today, clearing the eyes, wiping away the tears of grief, clearing the ears so you may hear again, and clearing the throat so you may speak clearly and be understood. And it's funny, even in the ceremony itself, at the end of it, it says, even just for one day. So I did a series. This was shown in Ottawa, the then CMCP, or the National Gallery now. And it was a good series, and the grave cover. So I started to really look at specific metaphors from the condolence ceremony. So I really focused on what it meant for the body, for the mind, and for the community to have this reciprocal relationship in this ceremony of requickening that allowed renewal to happen. The shadow, the faith keeper. So, you know, when I was first starting out, Judy Harris was working at the Woodland Cultural Center, and back then, most of the employees were longhouse people who worked at the Woodland Center. And so they really did encourage me, and you know, I went to them for advice, and they gave me a huge amount of acceptance, and so that meant the world for me moving forward. So I continued to do these portraits, and these were from Polaroid negatives. So I would give the positive away and keep the negative. And yeah, it was really, I did about 500 across Canada, from UBC, from Masset, Queen Charlotte Islands, to I photographed Rita Joe in Eskasoni, Surveyor. And I'm going to be probably making a book work out of these as well. So I think the thing is too that I did these in the late 90s, or in the 90s, and towards the end of the 90s. But you know, when I went around to try and get exhibitions for them in institutions, regional, provincial, federal, people were not ready to see these many faces and Indigenous faces. So there's been quite a huge change for me over my career to see things coming and going and changing, and so at all of these junctures, I've had to really do some writing. So there's self-reflexive times where I'll look at the work I've done, and then I reflect on it, and then I start writing about it, and then I move forward. So there's always just an intuitive gathering of images first, and then there's quite a gestation period of thought and more research, talking to different knowledge keepers, different people. You can see I had these little accordion books for these portraits, and I would show people. So there's quite a few portraits. And then I started to use my own, where I grew up, on Six Nations. So the trees that I grew up with, the burnt church, created my own metaphors for placing myself in the landscape. So you go from like I said in the video, you go from nationhood to the self, through community and family and nation, and so that's what I did. I went towards myself. And this is an old photograph from '59. It was published in the Brantford Expositor, so it's of a condolence ceremony at Sour Springs Longhouse. I'm just going to flip by and just let you see some. So dealing with mnemonics, again, some of the tile holders, mnemonics, I put them all together, all 50 of them in a print, some printmaking. I started to look at video as well, and this is a small installation. It can go much larger, but it's just a loop, a feedback loop that allows the wampum string to actually have energy flow through it. So it's basically feeding back on itself. So that was quite successful. DHEO bought a version of this. So you can see how I took some of the material culture that I had around me, and some more obscure. This is called Three Sleeps. So it's the notches on the notification stick with the short wampum that is delivered to different nations via the runners, and they carve off the number of sleeps off these notches. So I thought, what would the discards look like? So I made this sculpture. And this was quite important too. This was, I did a lot of work in residencies, and here I'm doing work as well. You can pop in at some point to see works in progress. But I started working as if it was a big table, as if I was looking down at the landscape. And so I photographed at the edge of the woods, and then I took the Mohawk words, the phrases from the Golan Center Banning that I've been working with. They're always sequenced, so they mean something else. And you can see different things there, God to prepare a seat for you. The end of the corner of the house, the shadow falls. So, that's where the wampum, the notification of death wampum will be in the shadow. We use a photograph from 1967 of an actual condolence ceremony walking down from the longhouse to the house. And just as these ideas of visualizing these mnemonics and this language. So sharing these images also means that, I'm also looking for a feeling. I'm also, as part of my aesthetic. And nowadays when I talk about my aesthetic, call it the restorative aesthetic. It's because its entry point was condolence. And so I photographed areas of trauma on the reserve, and to the left, my dad's tree called Renewal. I'm just gonna flip ahead because I'm running out of time, actually. So, looking at the silver covenant and each of the there's 5 needles in each white pine bundle that represent the founding 5 nations. So it's just, the whole idea of perpetuating these visual metaphors. And then I just worked on this at the AGO. I was an artist in residence, and I worked on some photographs of my dad's archive, and then I populated the books for the children from goodminds.com. And so you can see my father and my sister was a researcher who was the first librarian at the Woodland Center in 1971. 1972, yeah. It closed as a residential school, and the following year it opened as a cultural center. So you can imagine working there. And they were both, there was a long history in my family of collecting and diaries, and photographs, and audio recordings. So then I was an artist in residence at Art Gallery, York University. So I gave lectures, I made work. I had they gave us these boxes to use as architectural invitations. So I had a library for people to come and, a resource center basically. And then this was for a small exhibition. And then just returning again to cutting up the actual Great Law of Peace. It's published in Onondaga, called Concerning the League. And this was from a show from Gallery 44, which was very successful. I was really quite proud of it. Now let us proceed. Let us go forward. Let us, part of that aesthetically positive distinct forward movement. So I created all new works, and this is a large, again using that old photograph, a burnt out building on Six Nations, and a large adhesive on the wall on the left. So I work at different materials, and then work in small short series. So I started photography in high school, but I really learned a lot when I went to the Woodland Cultural Center as a summer student in the 70s and then in the 80s. And this is the darkroom there. So as I said, it had quite an effect on me. When things were, this was a little normalized. We thought, okay, we're in residential school, whatever that means. And so I learned photography and audio video there. So when I talk about positionality, you can see this sort of reflection the past 40 years of what I've seen and what I've experienced in the art world. And then this was a photograph of these pilings, which were actually part of the Grand River navigation company that ripped off a lot of money from Six Nations. So it was like this image I wanted to put on satin. Yeah, so the idea of working in series, you can have this visual sentence that's very much like embodied wampum paintings. And what I mean by wampum is that wampum represents our best intentions. And it represents the good mind, but it also is a string like a mnemonic. So the mnemonics are pictorial, the wampum, the language, photography, as I said before. So this is the longhouse from the 1600s in upstate New York. These were the longhouses were at one site. And then again, here's the sumac that was used as the first wampum by the peacemaker in Hiawatha. So yeah, it was a really good show. different things. This is cut scars into this canvas. Used, different things, trauma and renewal and among the pine needles. And very much interested in architecture as well, and how people, proxemics of how people react and behave in certain surroundings. So, and then, then I had a commission to do an exterior heritage site in Toronto called Todd Morton Mills for the Contact Photography Festival. So I reused, my first impression there was, they told me that a lot of World War II and World War I veterans used that area to camp in because they had been, they had PTSD really bad, so they had to stay outside and they'd be alone. So they used that whole area around Pottery Road, Bayview, the Don Valley. So I thought, okay, let's just, let's put up images of condolence. These are my photograph. This is an existing structure, so I just pre-visualized the wampum that I could print and string a notification string. So that worked well. And then just, using adhesive again, right onto the building. And then also using the map of Six Nations and the divisions that were created by the federal government in 1924. So, I put them right on the wall, which is kind of cool in terms of displacing place and looking at that. What I might do is I might make available on a site linked to Longhouse Labs some of my texts. I think that would be a good thing to do, right? They're not long texts, but they're just sort of, things I'm interested in, how I come, what my thoughts lead me after the project's over. So that's what I'll do, is I'll put it up. This is an exhibition called 1969. I use that date as a gateway, a time gateway into my youth and where things were at on the reserves. This is mold from my dad's house. But it was at the AGO, so that was a good show. Altamont was a disaster of a concert put on by the Rolling Stones, and I just subverted the whole idea of this, the patriarchal of that existence with a title holder, and the idea that clan mothers, choose the title holders. This is my father's dictionary. He only went to grade 5, but the fact that he wanted to know what the difference between right and rights are, and all the different words in between, like riot and rise, rigid, rigor. So I again, very much influenced by my father and grandfather, my sister's research and what they did. This happened in 1969. Eric Walkman's Confederacy Forever, Promises. This was in the Brantford Expositor. Again, the sumac. So there's quite a few, stirring the ashes. We used to use this barrel to burn stuff in. And of course, the white paper Indian policy from 1969 had a huge effect on people. They wanted, the federal government proposed to take away all rights, all status, and all lands. So you can juggle that. And then, of course, I'm interested in car crashes. I've seen a lot when I was a kid on the reserve, and so you take this autobiographical approach to your work, and you start asking yourself these questions of like, what am I drawn to? What visual what subject matter am I drawn to? Here's another statement. This was called Doga, I don't know, shrugging shoulders. So there's a whole list that I came up with, because I was tired of people asking me, or being the burden, taking on the burden of information. Please tell me this, please tell me that. You know, tell us about your ceremonies, and just this resource extraction in the art world. And even now today, I'm sure a lot of people here have these hesitancies. And so I took this idea of Doga, which is a slang from the language keepers that I worked with and that I saw in the 70s. And anthropologists and ethnographers would come to the Woodland Center, and they would just say, Doga, you know. I do know, but I'm not going to tell you. Or I'll tell you later. I'll tell you when you're ready. You know, these type of responses I saw, you know, some of the title holders and traditional people just respond that way to these requests. So in this case, I used, this was from my grade 4 handouts, foolscap, English, Mohawk words, which of course we learned, but didn't have anyone to talk to. And so each accent was put out by the teacher, and, you know, because there wasn't any. And so I added some tobacco ash, some oil paint, and some earth in each of those accents. And then I had the curators, because this traveled with an exhibition called Soundings. So, you know, you could do things like this and sort of push back a little gently. And so all 6 curators from Minneapolis to the rooms in Halifax had to get up, and because it was in the agreement that they have to do this, they have to read all those, plus a little bit more, and make a video for a webpage with my work on it. So, you know, and some of it was funny, some of them were hesitant, some of them were like, you know, it was just the whole gambit of emotion, you know, dealing with, you know, it's a real navigation dealing with shame and guilt, isn't it? It's like, you know, this idea of, we have the good mind, we have these teachings, but yet there's these barriers that are put up in front of us. This is called Runner's Continuum. This is just a little, this is going to be up in February at Derek Allard Hamilton. So I'm just going to flip through these. What would it be like if you were a runner? Pre-contact, but post-Great Law of Peace. So you knew the language, you knew the Great Law, the teachings were there being taught. You're a runner. It's your responsibility to memorize and to bring this along with these messages from nations to nations, and usually there's 2 runners, by the way. And so, you know, there's these newspaper things this is where the council house was in 1959 was taken over by the Confederacy and the RCP started, you know, they were assaulting people. So what would it be like to have the language and to be running and being able to see all of these different scenes, these different connections to the land that, you know, that were embedded in the Great Law and that we use from day to day and that really placed us. And then it's juxtaposed by this image with one of the washrooms in the residential school in Brantford. You know, this idea of looking towards home, back to the embrace of the longhouse. So yeah, there's, you know, I've learned a lot about myself and you know, the idea of sharing this information and being able to synthesize, really come up with new ideas visually challenge myself. And they start opening up different paths and different methods too. It's like, this is dance center. So I do really well in residencies, by the way, because it's so, focused. So this idea of using this jute I found at the center and tying 5 knots in them, representing the 5 nations, representing the pathway that the runners would take. It's a really powerful thing in this sort of semi-bureaucratical idea of the wampum being caged into this file folder. That's, I think there's a lot here that we could talk about. And this is just ending the GGRs, so this is about the dust. Dust is our enemy as being Hodinosho, because when it covers things, you can't hear, you can't see what's underneath, what's between the dust and the actual object. And it's our responsibility to clear the dust, to clear the way. Even when someone passes away, there people are there to sweep the houses of the deceased, to sweep around the houses. So I chose this room at the National Gallery, which was the Duchamp room, and because some of his methodologies and theories are similar, like what's called inframents, which is basically a phenomenon of, when somebody gets up from the seat and it's still warm, what's left behind, that idea. And I did this drawing of these wampum strings, and then I did this sculpture. So a ready-made frame and 50 strings of white wampum for renewal, and then showed them a couple places. And had a good response. And this was in Montreal. And there's the National Gallery. So it worked quite well. This is just for scale. I'm not that narcissistic. But. So it really did work quite well in that space. And usually, just logistically, when I'm having an exhibition somewhere, I print and I make works for the space, so the viewer can have a great time coming through the space itself. So see how great that looks together? These ready-mades from the 20s and 30s. And these are just a few images, 3 images of the stuff I'm working on now at Waterloo Labs, and this idea of inversion, of seeing things that are beyond black and white, and having this sort of celestial effect as well. It was quite surprising. I'll make this quite large. And also, photographing the sumac again, I'm always drawn back to certain things. Let me just read just a little bit here. Okay. Or you can read it. Thank you to the ancestors, a sacred meeting space where we can communicate with one another and be really clear about who we are in our relationships. As our conversation evolves, we come to a real understanding of what the other means. This is what we refer to as Hodinosho, the good mind, which is needed to come to Waterloo. This sacred space is where the ship and the canoe originally agreed upon the Waterloo wampum, and today is the place to which we must return in order to talk about the impacts that we have experienced because of its violation. So this is from a really good book that's available at Good Point by Norma Jacobs. And so I'm working with her as well. And there I am, there's the studio over at Longhouse Labs. So there's my home studio, so there's my Instagram address if you want to see more. And I think that's it.
had a question in your initial video for the original work. You are seen with an analog camera, and much of your work is very tied in with black and white. The work that you're working on in multi-class, so you were playing with some black and white photos. I'm just wondering if you could touch on maybe how you combat or how you play with an extension of the reading or process there of the idea of disappearing Indians or Indigenous folks being just very much in the past. The use of black and white analog there is an interesting dynamic.
So you're wanting to know that if there's a parallel between the changing analog to digital and to, I guess, knowledge that's disappearing?
Sure.
Yes? Can't see these. Well, I mean, the thing is that these things evolve, and the education that has to come from within and the motivation for it to learn and to see a new generation on Six Nations, and mostly women and some young men taking up these roles and relationships within traditional life and learning language and learning just being there as I had knowledge keepers there. And there's a continuum, that's what I'm saying, and it's quite amazing and heartwarming to see that happen. The idea of being from analog to digital. I'm not sure what the question really meant, but I mean it's everything has a learning curve, and even in our bodies, as our bodies change and grow older, there's a learning curve, there's priorities, there's different things you're focused on because of, the mind, the body, the place, those around you, your community. How's your community changing for the good or the not so good? So that's all I have to say.
We have a question from online chat. It says, could you tell us a little bit more about your creative evolution from condolence to restorative aesthetic?
Well, without getting too personal, I think one of the main thing that I do with my work is I infuse a lot of the private, right? There's private messages, there's private information embedded in a lot of my work. And I think that's one of the ways that we can express ourselves, express the wordless, the unspeakable, through the work itself, and you can still see yourself and others can see them. So a lot of people from on Six Nations and other Hodinosho, and to a certain degree other nations, can see these metaphors and relate to them on a really deep level and recognize them as old friends. There it is. But it's without language. So, now we're looking at these images as placemakers. But I think the main thing is that when I grew up, I was influenced by Rick Hill Sr., Tuscarora of Six Nations, and worked at the Smithsonian in the 70s. He always said creativity is our tradition. The idea of creation, of giving birth, of the Sky Woman, of the first fall, the first trauma. All of these things have deep meanings with ourselves. The idea of Atarho, his mind was crooked, and there was, he came to the good mind by the help of the peacemaker at Iwaka. you know, it is possible to basically to challenge and face that Hodinosho within all of us. That's what a lot of us think these days. You know, there's these things that challenge the good mind, and yeah. So I think that's true.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? I can say that, like, certainly what you're speaking to about people finding familiarity in your work, it was true for me as a former Haudenosaunee person and someone who's like specifically spent time with Six Nations. So like, you know, that being out of province and living out of province and stuff and seeing some of your work places like New Mexico was kind of cool too. But oh, that's home. That's a piece of home. And certainly the textures and all that. It's felt very familiar. One of the questions I have is about reciprocity. Certainly, I can see as an artist too that I see my artwork as like me taking our knowledge and our research and things and like giving that back to the public to take something with. Is that kind of the way you're approaching too? Like, this kind of brings us to this next question too. It says, could you give us a little more information about the main purpose behind all of your work? That's what it said. Big question.
What's today? I mean, the thing is that it's moving towards, as I said in the video, moving towards becoming a full member, getting across all those barriers. I mean, the whole thing about the condolence ceremony, your people are, it says in the ceremony, you come through thorny bushes and across dangerous lands, and you've seen bodies lying there, and with the cattails and the bushes and the water trembling in fear, and so there's all this negativity built up as you're traveling. And then you come at the edge of the woods and you see a clearing, and in that clearing are people welcoming you. So, you know, it is very strong, it's very powerful when you get into these metaphors and you're trying to better yourself and pursue the good mind and really, you know, and also to use the Thanksgiving address as you know, in the Thanksgiving address in the original languages, in the depth of them, gratitude. There's one little syllable that represents the sacred relationships between two people, or two things, you know. There's also, you know, this idea that everything needs to be appreciated. So this whole idea of appreciating, giving thanks, and of placing yourself in creation on a daily basis, you know, really does center you in terms of moving forward with your day, to have this idea that, you know, it's almost like a reset with the Thanksgiving address. So I think that, I mean, the reason I do my work is to move forward towards those ideals of being Hodinosho. I mean, in my artist in residence at the HGO, I had Rick Hill and Jolene Rickard. She teaches at Ithaca. They came, and we reptiled it, always thinking about this. What does it mean to be Hodinosho? And we're constantly challenging ourselves with those questions. In the grocery store, you see somebody and we go deep and then laugh, buy the Cheerios and move on. You know, but it's one of those things where we're constantly thinking about what it means to be who we are.
Thank you. Is there any other questions in the room?
Thank you for the talk, and I loved what you're saying about going towards yourself and asking what you're drawn to. It's just a really good reminder, like as an emerging artist, to always, and someone that went through the school system and was always told how to do things somebody else's way, to remember to do it your own way. And my question is actually about the school systems. It sounds like you do a lot of work in universities, which I find surprising considering what you said about being maybe tired of taking on the burden of information. And I'm thinking about, like you said, the resource extraction in the art world, and I'm thinking about the kind of knowledge extraction of the university and the academic space. So what draws you to working in universities, and what role do you think universities play in your work? Yeah.
Well, these relationships started with artist-run centers, and I just used that template of relationship to other areas where I would identify like-minded people. And so if there's somebody in an institution, such as Logan and Longhouse Flats, if there's an opportunity, there's a space now. Before there was no space, so I would have to really, it was really person to person. I have to see if, like some people can loose, Liz, her last name, but she was a curator there. She used to work at Carfax. She was, people who were progressive and who had worked in community in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they were still there when I was growing up in artist-run centers and that. So I just outreached to them. And what I was saying, along the way, I've experienced, you have a tendency to burn out from a lot of different questions. And that's why I started writing as well, primarily to fulfill not only it was a responsibility to the work I produced, and then I would write a short text about what thought process around that specific work, so people could understand it a little better. And in terms of universities, I mean, it is a very weird feeling. I'm sure some people can relate to this, but it's a very weird feeling in the art world. Or 30 years ago when I was younger and doing all this work, and no one would pick it up. No one would. And the same people that are there still today, the gatekeepers in the art world and regional, not so much arts from a different thing, but they're still there. And I don't trust them. The trust is gone when you have that type of, and now they're totally embracing me, and it's like, fawning almost. So it gets a bit weird when you become flavor of the decade. And not so much around the Governor General's Award, because that was sort of something different, something separate. My nominators were great. Even in the nomination, we had to combine Greg's writing and Philip Monk's writing, and to give the jury, the mixed jury, the broad strokes of what it is to be Hodinosho in the art world, and what it is to navigate your own voice and your visual voice. But at this point in time, my audience really is people who are Hodinosho, people back home, wherever that is, right? And for them to have that feeling, that embrace that I talked about, a cultural embrace of like, oh, these are the metaphors that have sustained us, that have really, these relationships with the natural world, with each other, with the clan mothers, with the matriarchal society, with all these songs and dances and ceremonies that sustained us through a lot.
That's beautiful, thank you. We're kind of getting close to our end of time here, so if there's a pressing question in the room, we can take that. Otherwise, we have maybe one quick question here that came in. Just looking around, I don't see any hands. Okay, so we'll just have the last question here is about the trees in your work. How is the sumac and the other trees significant to you Could you explain a little bit more about that?
I mean, I grew up on 3 acres for the first 9 years of my life, and then my parents divorced. I moved all over the place. There's 6 places. And, but it was those initial trees that I still had a relationship with, and I was a solitary child, and climbing them, hanging out at the top, and swaying back and forth in the wind. You know, you really do, develop these strong relationships to place. And even when I was playing with sticks, and that resembled bones from the white oak, how they come together like this, the branches. I still use those. And so a lot of the things that from childhood and from my memories of the way people talk and the way people were slower and breathing slower and being, very comfortable with themselves, and they were, especially traditional Longhouse people. And I vowed when I was very young that I wanted that. I wanted that idea and the physicality of breathing, handling stress, and anxiety, and trauma, etc. So, I think, as someone who went to Indian day school on 6 Nations and suffered a fair amount of lateral violence, you develop this idea of yourself, and then you have to relate it somehow to the natural world. You have to be able to be honest with yourself. So, and then just have others just sort of observe you doing that. But that's what I'm still doing. But yeah, it's a way to introduce young people into the natural world and the ideas and the imagination and the belonging, especially the belonging to that 3 acres. I mean, for many years, all I did was go back to that 3 acres and go back to Toronto, and photograph and just be there. Even after my father passed away. So, and the camera allowed me to do that. That was that mediator that still allows me to do that. And you can go into a dissociative state as well when you're taking photographs. I call it wandering with purpose. There's this idea that, you're gathering, you're gleaning, you're intuitively gathering these images. A lot of people say, oh, you've lost your culture and language. I said, no, they're there on the ground waiting to be picked up. So,
Yeah, I agree. All right, I think that's where we're going to end it today. I want to thank you all for coming, for your time. And again, thank you, Greg Staats, for all of your work and your voice and need to do for our community. I think we'll end it there.